There is something you need to hear right now, and it is the kind of thing that catches most people completely off guard. They never see it coming. The moment you stopped pursuing them, they felt it. Not gradually, not after some delay where the reality slowly settled in. It lands immediately, like a shift in atmosphere they can't quite explain but can't ignore either. Something that used to be reliably present is suddenly no longer feeding the same familiar emotional rhythm, and the nervous system notices before the mind has time to build a story around it. At first, they try to treat it as normal, a pause, a temporary adjustment, something that will reset itself if left alone long enough. But the silence behaves differently this time. It doesn't resolve into reassurance. It doesn't soften back into predictability. It stays, and in staying, it begins to accumulate meaning. What they lose is not just your attention, but the ease of your presence. The emotional availability they could once access without effort is no longer there to stabilize the space between you, and that absence creates friction, small at first, then increasingly difficult to dismiss. They feel it in moments they didn't expect, pauses in their day, unfinished thoughts, sudden memories that arrive without invitation and refuse to leave quickly. The mind begins its work of interpretation, searching for explanations that preserve emotional comfort. Maybe you're busy, maybe you're pulling back for reasons unrelated to them, maybe this is temporary, but underneath those rationalizations, something more honest begins to form. A recognition that your energy is no longer being directed toward them in the way it once was. And that recognition is destabilizing in a specific way, because it introduces consequence where before there was ease. It replaces assumption with uncertainty. It removes the quiet expectation of return. They start to notice the space you occupied more clearly than they ever did when you were filling it. The conversations that once felt routine now feel different in their absence. The consistency they didn't fully register at the time becomes visible only after it stops. This is where internal conflict begins to build, not necessarily expressed outwardly, but lived inwardly. A tension between pride and awareness, between emotional self-protection and the growing realization that something meaningful is no longer being maintained on the same terms. And the more they sit with that tension, the harder it becomes to keep treating the situation as something they can remain passive about. Because your absence is not neutral, it is active. It is shaping perception, reorganizing memory, and altering the emotional weight of everything that came before it. Moments that once felt casual begin to look significant in hindsight. Small gestures begin to carry new importance. The pattern becomes harder to unsee, and still, nothing is being demanded of them from the outside. There is no pressure, no pursuit, no insistence pulling them forward. That is exactly what makes the experience so confronting. They are left alone with the reality of what your presence meant, without the cushion of your ongoing effort to soften it. Eventually, the mind reaches a point where explanation is no longer enough, where avoidance stops feeling stable, where the absence begins to ask its own questions, quietly but persistently. Questions that cannot be fully answered without some form of inner honesty they have been delaying. And that is the moment everything starts to shift, not because they have resolved it, but because they can no longer fully ignore it. They felt it almost immediately. And not in the way you might be picturing if you imagine them feeling relieved or unbothered or quietly pleased to finally have some breathing room. That is not what happened at all. What happened was something far more uncomfortable for them. The moment they registered your withdrawal, a clarity arrived in them that they were not prepared for. A sharp, sudden, almost frightening kind of clarity that moved through them and disturbed something deep. The kind of clarity that shakes a person from the inside out and leaves them unsure of what to do with what they now know. When you stop chasing someone, the world does not just shift a little. It does not produce small ripples that settle quickly. What it produces is a profound and invisible process of unraveling that begins inside the person you stepped back from. Not on the surface, not in any way that necessarily shows itself immediately in their behavior or their words, but in the interior architecture of who they are. Something begins to come apart in there, quietly, without announcement, but unmistakably. And this is where the situation becomes genuinely complicated for them. genuinely risky in a way they could not have anticipated and cannot easily manage. The first thing they encounter is an empty space. Not a physical emptiness, not the absence of a body in a room, but something more pervasive and more disorienting than that. They become aware of a gap where your attention and your energy and your reaching used to live. And what makes this particularly destabilizing is that they had no idea that space was even there before. It existed below their awareness, invisible, because it was always filled, the way you don't notice the air in a room until it is somehow different. Now that it is no longer being filled by your pursuit, your availability, your consistent presence at the end of whatever distance they put between you, they feel the shape of it. And the shape is larger than they expected. It is wide and open and strangely quiet in a way that does not sit comfortably with them. They are not practiced at sitting with that kind of quiet. They have never had to be. So what begins in them, beneath the surface of whatever composed exterior they are still managing to maintain, is panic. A low, spreading, sourceless panic that they cannot explain clearly even to themselves. Your absence is not functioning in their mind the way an ordinary absence functions. It is not simply a neutral lack of something. It is working like a mirror. That is the most accurate way to describe what is happening, and the thing about a mirror is that it shows you things regardless of whether you want to see them. Your withdrawal has held up something reflective in front of them, and they are catching glimpses of themselves in it that are deeply unsettling. They are beginning to realize in that reluctant and uncomfortable way that true realizations tend to arrive, that the sense of power and control they experienced in relation to you, that feeling of being the one who held the balance, the one who could come and go and be received warmly, regardless of how much or how little they gave, that feeling has gone completely. And the going of it is not neutral. When that kind of control disappears, the inner world does not simply adjust and move on. It grows restless. It becomes uneasy in a way that spreads into everything. It turns desperate in ways that feel confusing because the desperation doesn't have a clean, simple cause they can point to and address. What begins to happen in the quieter, deeper parts of their mind is that uncomfortable truths start moving. The truths they successfully managed during the day, the ones they could outrun with distraction and activity and the ordinary business of their life, those truths come back when the noise settles. They come back at night. They come back in the in-between moments. And one of the most uncomfortable among them is this question that forms itself almost involuntarily, a question they genuinely did not want to have to ask themselves. Did I want this person for who they actually are? For the genuine substance of them and what we were to each other? Or did I want them for how they made me feel about myself, for the sense of importance their pursuit gave me, for the confirmation of my own value that arrived automatically every time they reached toward me? Now that the reaching has stopped, the honest answer to that question is becoming visible, and it is not entirely flattering. The image they constructed of themselves within this connection, the image of someone desirable enough to be chased, important enough to be consistently pursued, valuable enough to be waited for, that image is beginning to fracture. And though they cannot yet see the full picture of what they are looking at, they can feel the fracture happening. Their mind in this state is divided. It exists in a tension between what they hope is still possible and what they are genuinely afraid might be true. And that division creates a particular kind of interior noise that is very difficult to live with. It drives them toward a restlessness that has no clean outlet. They begin to construct images of your life continuing without them in it. They picture you laughing at things that have nothing to do with them. They picture you giving your attention and your warmth to other people, other conversations, other moments that they are not part of. And each of these imagined scenes registers as a kind of silent hurt, a bruising they cannot show anyone because to show it would be to admit how much it matters, and they are not ready to admit that yet. And here is the part that surprises people when they learn it. What they are feeling is not a clean, single emotion. It is not just longing, though, that is present. It is not just sadness. There is anger woven in with everything else. Anger that sits alongside fear and a guilt they cannot properly organize or locate. These things mix together in a way that produces behavior that can seem strange or out of character or difficult to predict. Because none of it is being processed cleanly, None of it is moving through them in a healthy and orderly way. They are carrying a complicated internal weather system, and it is affecting how they function in ways that don't always have obvious explanations. The natural response for most people in this situation is avoidance, to look for a way around the discomfort rather than through it, to construct some version of events that minimizes how much any of this is actually affecting them, to perform indifference, to insist to themselves and to anyone who might be watching that they are fine and unbothered and moving through their days with the same ease as before. But the performance costs something, and underneath it, the process you set in motion simply by stepping back continues to do what it does regardless of what they tell themselves or anyone else. You brought this into existence for them just by pulling back, just by stopping the chase and letting them sit in the quiet you left behind. Something deep and essential woke up in them when you did that. Something that had been resting under layers of convenient self-deception and comfortable assumption stirred back to life and began to make itself known. That inner voice, the one that stayed quiet for so long because it had no reason to speak up while everything was proceeding in a direction that felt comfortable and controlled, has gotten louder. And what it is saying to them is something they did not want to hear. It is saying they cannot afford to lose you. It is saying they cannot let go of this as easily as they thought they could. They find themselves going back over things, conversations they barely paid attention to at the time, messages they glossed over, moments that seemed small and unimportant when they happened, but that are now assembling themselves into something that carries weight. They are examining their own behavior with an honesty they did not apply when they were in the comfortable position of being pursued. They are examining yours too. They are trying to locate the exact point where they might still have the ability to pull things back in a direction that works for them. And this is where it starts to feel most frightening for them. Because the need to do something is building, not in a planned, considered, intentional way necessarily, but in the urgent, slightly irrational way that the human mind generates urgency when it is dealing with an open loop it cannot close. When it is confronted with uncertainty, it cannot resolve through any of the usual methods. The human mind hates unresolved uncertainty more than it hates almost anything else. And you have placed them inside an unresolved uncertainty that they do not know how to exit. You may not be able to see any of this from where you're standing. From your position, the silence might feel like nothing. It might feel like a small decision you made that isn't necessarily producing any visible consequences. But what you cannot see is the scale of what is operating beneath the surface of what they show the world. Absence, when it is the withdrawal of something that genuinely mattered, even when that mattering was never properly acknowledged, becomes one of the most powerful forces available. It does things that direct action cannot do. It reaches places that words cannot reach. It works in ways that all the conversations and confrontations and explanations in the world could never manage to replicate. The moment they arrived at the understanding that they cannot make you chase them anymore, something gave way. The outer image, the composed and in-control presentation of someone who has everything arranged the way they want it, began to slip. And when that image slips, when the outer layer that has been managing people's perception of the situation starts to come apart, everything that was being held behind it starts to move toward the light. All the things they pushed down, all the things they told themselves did not really matter, all the things they denied for years because acknowledging them would have cost them something, those things begin their slow and inevitable ascent toward the surface. And what is emerging is not comfortable for them, because the calm, cool, unbothered person they have been presenting to the world and to themselves is no longer who they recognize when they are alone with their thoughts. Making sense of this is genuinely hard for them. Even in moments when the full weight of what is happening tries to become clear, they struggle to hold on to the understanding. Their thinking around this is not organized or coherent. It keeps slipping out of their grasp. But the feelings don't require understanding to operate. The feelings are running their course regardless. In your silence, in the absence you created simply by stopping, you have become the center of an interior collapse that they did not see coming and do not know how to manage. And what makes this significant? What keeps this from being just another story of someone pulling back and the other person feeling the normal discomfort of that is what comes after. Because what comes after is something they genuinely cannot predict. They cannot see the shape of it yet. They are inside it without a map. Here is a truth that most people keep hidden even from their own clearest thinking. Absence is scarier than rejection in many ways. Rejection is defined. It has edges and a clear shape. You can look at it directly and know what you are dealing with. Absence is different. Absence is formless. It is an open space, and an open space does not stay empty. The mind fills it. The mind fills it with every unexamined fear and every buried insecurity and every secret worry that has been waiting for exactly this kind of opening. And so the absence you created has become for them a canvas onto which everything they have been carefully not looking at is now painting itself in very vivid colors. That is where the real complexity begins. That is where everything starts to get genuinely intricate and difficult for them. They begin noticing things they never tracked before. Every gap in communication, every response that came a little slower than usual, every moment of your attention that was directed somewhere other than at them, things that would have registered as nothing particular before are now registering as significant. They are examining them with an attention and an intensity that they would have considered unnecessary previously. That comment that seemed offhand, that moment you laughed at something that had nothing to do with them, the message they saw you post that didn't involve them in any way, all of it gets collected and revisited. All of it gets run through an increasingly anxious interpretive process that is trying very hard to find patterns, to construct a coherent narrative out of what is actually just the natural evidence of your life continuing without them at its center. And in that obsessive revisiting, doubt starts to accumulate. They begin questioning their own judgments and assessments. Did they read this wrong from the beginning? Did they push too hard in the wrong direction at the wrong moment? Did they undervalue what they had when they had full access to it? Did they make choices they would make differently now? Every doubt that they successfully suppressed while they were in the comfortable position of being certain of your continued availability has now resurfaced and is asking to be addressed. And they don't have good answers for any of it. The mind in this state does not accept loss quietly or with any kind of dignity. It looks immediately for ways to fix what it perceives as broken. When a direct fix is not available, it invents alternatives. It creates stories. It constructs scenarios. It generates reasons and explanations and justifications that attempt to restore some sense of control or agency over a situation that has slipped out of control in ways that feel deeply uncomfortable. How does this show itself in practice? It starts small, a quick impulse to reach out that they suppress but feel, a casual check of your activity online that they tell themselves is nothing in particular, a thought about you that arrives without being invited and lingers longer than they are comfortable with. And then it grows. The thoughts become more frequent. The impulse to do something, to make some kind of contact or gesture, becomes more persistent. Regret begins to accumulate and compound until it has a physical quality, a sharpness and a bitterness that is hard to sit with. They start to feel trapped inside their own thinking because your distance has activated something very fundamental in them. It has activated the recognition that they cannot get what they want through the old methods. The charm that used to work easily doesn't have anywhere to land anymore. The assumption that your availability was permanent has been exposed as the assumption it always was. And that exposure is producing a pressure in them that has no clean release valve. This is typically the point where people start to become genuinely unsteady in their thinking. Because the human mind is not designed to remain functional and comfortable under conditions of complete powerlessness. The deep and hidden worry that they might actually lose you permanently is now operating alongside every other thought they try to have, coloring everything, adding an undercurrent of urgency to experiences that would otherwise be neutral. And this worry does not operate through their conscious, logical, reasoning mind. It operates through something older and more instinctive, something that doesn't wait for rational analysis before sending up its distress signal, something that simply responds to perceived threat with the full force of everything it has. And here is the difficult part that many people never want to look at directly. Their inner mind, the part operating below the level of their deliberate thoughts and carefully maintained self-image, has started making plans. Not the kind of plans that get reviewed and considered and weighed for their wisdom. The other kind. The kind that emerge from fear and wounded pride, and the desperate need to restore a sense of agency over something that has moved beyond their control. They might frame it to themselves as caring more, as finally showing up in the ways they should have been showing up all along. Or they might frame it differently, as a need to reclaim something, to reassert something, to make sure that you cannot simply withdraw without consequences. When pride is under serious threat, the line between what is reasonable and what is not becomes much easier to cross without noticing. All the pleasant, composed presentations they have been making, all the reasonable and measured versions of themselves they have been showing the world, begin to feel much harder to maintain. The emotions underneath are too big and too persistent to be contained indefinitely by social performance. They are dealing with a tangle of wanting and jealousy and guilt and shame that arrives all at once and exceeds what their normal coping mechanisms were built to handle, and they cannot yet act from a steady place. They are swinging between two experiences that have nothing to do with each other and everything to do with you. In one moment they are consumed by the desire for your attention, desperate for some confirmation that the connection is not irreparably broken. In the next, they are disturbed by how much they need that confirmation, disturbed by the strength of their own wanting, pulling back from the admission of need because need feels exposing and dangerous to someone who has built their identity around not needing things. And here is the irony that sits at the center of all of this. You did remarkably little to create these conditions. You simply stopped going after them. You removed your pursuit. You redirected your energy. And that small, quiet act, that withdrawal of the active seeking that they had grown to depend on and take for granted, has done more to disrupt their inner world than anything you could have said or done or confronted them with directly. It has woken up the parts of them that were sleeping under the comfortable assumption of your perpetual availability. It has surfaced the things they were hiding behind that assumption. It has brought face to face with their own patterns, their own withholding, their own fear of genuine need in a way that cannot be talked around or argued with. These parts of them had been quiet for years, kept manageable by the ongoing supply of your reaching. Now that the supply is cut, they are making themselves loudly, uncomfortably known. Most people will try to escape this as quickly as possible. They will reach for distraction, they will reach for logic and rationalization. They will find ways to tell themselves a story about the situation that requires less honesty than the situation actually demands. But this particular discomfort does not respond well to logic or distraction. It is not a surface-level emotional reaction that settles with time and enough redirection. It is something structural, something that has worked its way into the foundation of their thinking and their self-perception, and it is leaking into their daily life in ways they cannot fully prevent or control. The longer your absence continues, the more intense this process becomes. Because every day you continue to exist independently, every day your life demonstrates its own momentum and its own fullness that has nothing to do with their permission or their participation, the pressure inside them increases. They notice how you carry yourself now. They notice that you are not in pieces. They notice that you are not performing your own distress for their benefit. They notice that your days have a texture and a quality that is not dependent on whether or not they have chosen to show up. And every observation adds to the internal pressure that is building in them, because it removes the comfortable possibility that you need them the way they are beginning to understand they need you. They are caught now between the strength of their desire and their reluctance to acknowledge the vulnerability that desire represents. Between what they desperately want and what they feel capable of admitting they want out loud. And in that stuck, suspended place between wanting and admitting, their mind begins generating scenarios it would not have produced in a more settled state. Scenarios about reclaiming influence, scenarios about connection restored, scenarios about somehow getting even for the experience of powerlessness that your withdrawal put them in, because your stepping back has made something undeniable that was previously easy to deny. You are not theirs to direct. You were never a fixed point they owned or managed. You were always a person making a series of choices about where to invest your energy, and those choices could, at any time, be redirected. The fact that it took them this long to genuinely register this reality only increases the difficulty of sitting with it. Here is what is true now. They are alert in a way they were not alert before, even if they are not fully conscious of all the dimensions of what is happening in them. Your absence is acting like a mirror that strips away their emotional comfort and forces them to confront themselves, creating inner tension, awareness, and potential change. But whether they grow from it or retreat into avoidance is uncertain, and the real shift remains your choice to step back and reclaim your own center rather than remain in an unbalanced dynamic.